my pleasure to now bring to the stage Emeritus Professor David Uzzell, who ran the Environmental Psychology MSc program from 1985 to 2002, and he's the first UK psychologist to undertake research on the psychology of climate change. So thank you very much for your unique contribution to the field.
Thank you very much. Just want to add something to what Birgitta said about her story of coming to Surrey. I thought I'd tell you all this. She phoned me up. She phoned me up asking about the job and criticised what I was intending to do. She said, I wouldn't do it like that. I think you should do it like this. And I thought, she's the one. She's the one I want. Certainly proven to be the case. David provided a really nice account of the early years of environmental psychology. The title of my part is What Came Next? Well, some of what came before continued, but of course we must always remember that there's never just one history. There are multiple histories, and David in fact touched on some of those in his talk. David's work on architecture and in particular place was clearly groundbreaking for the area. But some of that work took a different form. Certainly the interest in place and people-environment relationships, which of course has been core to the whole history of environmental psychology. And I just want to give a shout to Claire Twigger-Ross, who's going to be speaking later on. I mean, Claire did her PhD on place attachment and place identity, and it was the most fantastic piece of work. And it's been cited 2,250 times in journals. It's one of the most cited publications there is in the area, and second only to the work of Harold Prashansky, who started that area on place identity. So a really significant piece of work. So I think Claire deserves a mention for that. If I'm to talk about what came next, I want to briefly mention two other members of the department, people whose faces you've seen, Peter Stringer and Terence Lee. And you'll see why I want to do that in a minute. Terry came to Surrey as professor and first head of department in 1971. He'd worked under Sir Frederick Bartlett at Cambridge. By some bizarre quirk of fate, Bartlett had been approached by the Labour government to advise on the rebuilding of bombed out Britain, and in particular to look at neighbourhood units and new towns, and to suggest how these could be designed in a way that reflected how people thought about what is local, what is community, what is the neighbourhood. Now, developing Bartlett's concepts of schema, Terry believes socio-spatial schemata not only provided an insight into people's inner representations of space and place, but these in turn provided templates for the design of urban spaces. Another hugely important figure was Peter Stringer. Peter came from a completely different sort of background. Peter studied classics at Oxford, then worked as a researcher at the Bartlett School of Planning at UCL. He was strongly influenced by George Herbert Mead's work, and Peter explored the way people think about and structure their conceptions of the environment, drawing on relational approaches in social psychology and personal construct theory. And this involved for him, in terms of turning this into practice, was doing work on public participation in planning, which was very much the vogue in the late 60s, early 70s. Now, why do I think it's important to mention these two other figures from here? I think like David's work, Terry and Peter's work had a number of important characteristics. It was directly related to significant and current policy issues in terms of the environment. It was designed to lead to practical outcomes. And much of this work was interdisciplinary, working with other disciplines such as architecture, planning, design, landscape architecture, as well as some of the other social and natural sciences and humanities. And perhaps in some respects, it was very significant because it was funded by government departments. And this was very unusual at the time. In the late 70s, early 80s, certainly in terms of psychology departments, people tended to go to the research councils for money. Very few psychology departments went to government. I think I've now got to the point where I think Brigitte thought I would start. So what happened next? Well, in the early years of environmental psychology, there was a lot of work going on in issues such as privacy, personal space, crowding, landscape perception, and so on and so forth. Not so interesting. And this was replaced by a growing concern about the damage being done to the global environment and the need for environmental conservation. And a lot of that certainly came from the conservation movement in this country, but especially from the United States. This was the time, we're talking now about the late 70s and the 80s, this was the time of major environmental disasters, whether we're talking about oil spills like the Amoco Cadiz and the Exxon Valdez, the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, and so on. So the environment then became really quite a hot topic that the government really needed to pay attention to. Risk research became very important in the department. Terry and Jennifer Brown at the time were doing work on, for example, the siting and disposal of nuclear waste and chemical waste. There was David's work on fires, and one could add in the late 1990s, Brigitte's work looking at working with the local authority to examine transport-generated air pollution and sustainable transport. All of these within a kind of risk context. I think in the department and the research we were doing, we were putting a unique stamp on this work by arguing that you cannot separate the way people see the environment, think about it, have attitudes, concerns, preferences, and act without considering their transactions with space and place. And more than ever, governments could see that environmental psychology had an important role in informing government, in informing policy. An interesting story, I think probably one of the first times, well certainly the first time in the department, we got money from the EC, was in the mid-1990s, with their framework programs, which was the what came before the Horizon programs now. And I was always told that if you want to get money from government departments and so on, you really had to make sure that when they put out their call for proposals, your project was in there, so you could then apply and they say, oh yes, we've got to have that. So in order to do that, you had to go and speak to people in government so to make them aware. So I went across to Brussels to see the head of the framework program and said, look, why aren't you doing anything on a particular thing I was interested in, which was children and the environment. You know, a lot of environmental psychology work here. It shows it's so important. He said, environmental psychology, what's that? So I spent the next hour talking to him about environmental psychology. And his final words were, we've got to have some of that in this program. And then when the final call came out, there was my project. Brilliant result. And that then began, you know, a history of getting research funding from the EU and the sort of sums of money that David was mentioning earlier on. Now, I think what I've been talking about has had a significance beyond the research we were doing. It became part of the culture of the environmental psychology team, if I can call it that, and to a certain extent other parts of the department. And this carried over into the MSc. I think in a lot of places, people talk about the MSc programs as there's the MSc program. And, it's a kind of a little separate thing. Whereas in Surrey, we've always seen the MSc program, certainly the environmental one, as integral to other teaching that we're doing in environmental psychology, the research we're doing. We didn't make that kind of distinction you often find elsewhere. And as I say, it carried over to the MSc course. It had an impact on the design of the curricula and how it was taught, and I think also the type of students that we attracted. I think one of the things that was a remarkable characteristic of the course was that we just didn't attract psychology students. We attracted architects, planners, designers, landscape architects. I mean, we had some chap who came on the course with a background degree in theology. One year we had two people with a background in nursing studies. We were just interested in people who were interested in the relationship between people and the physical environment. And that mix was a very powerful mix that was beneficial for all concerned, for other students and for the staff. Many of the students who came on the course came as professionals. They didn't just come from a first degree. I mean, it's quite notable. It always struck me that a significant number of students came at the age of 27 or 28. They'd got their first degree, they'd worked in the professional world for some 5 years, and then they realised that there was something missing. If they were to do their job in the way, really? If they were to do their job in the way they wanted to, they needed psychology, and it would actually set them apart in their practice. They were all interested in different aspects of the environment, whether we're talking about from the micro level to the macro level. All the people that you saw on those slides, Ian Griffiths, for example, Peter Wood, they were doing work at the sort of micro scale, building scale, room scale. Then there was David doing work at the building level. I was doing work at the city level, neighbourhood level, and then global level, and so on. So we're dealing with a whole range of different environments. And the other thing is we attracted students from all around the world with a huge range of different experiences, different environments. And this made for a very rich environment in which to do work. Okay, I've been told I've got less than 2 minutes. I'm going to finish with a story about one student. So I want to personalise this to a certain extent. Because I think David mentioned we had the most, students were doing some remarkable studies. And I just want to talk about one student. A student who, prior to coming to Surrey, had worked on various Royal Naval contracts as a consultant and had high level of security clearance. She said she wanted to do some work on a ship. Obviously, for some reason. I arranged for us to go down to Portsmouth Naval Base, saw a senior officer down there. We sat down and said, look, we're interested in doing some work on the shipboard environment. Is there anything that you will be particularly interested in? He gave us various ideas and so on and talked about the issues, problems of working on a ship and so on. We came back to Surrey And we said, he doesn't need that. He needs to do something on psychological contracts. And he needs to do something on, given the operational and living constraints on board ships, how do environmental factors impinge on psychological contracts? We wrote back to him and said, look, we would like to suggest this. He said, well, it's extraordinary that you should write this, because I've just had this communication, or they usually talk about signals. You just had this signal from the Second Sea Lord saying, this is exactly the work that we should be doing now. So the doors were open. The consequence of this is that the Navy flew Sarah out to Korea. She did interviews and data collection in Portsmouth first, flew out to Korea. She then went on a Type 42 frigate and sailed to Japan, working on the ship, and then came back to Surrey and wrote it up for her dissertation. Wow. I mean, a little exceptional, perhaps, but it just shows you the incredibly rich work that a lot of the students were doing at an MSc level. Creative, imaginative, and useful, and having an impact on the world out there. Thank you very much.